Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Vathrúðnir hvað, or eilífógum stukku eitardrópar, sva óks uns varð jötun. Þar orar ættir komu allar saman, því það allt til atalt.
I have written a lot about this subject, but I have only ever really touched on it briefly here on the show. If you read the stuff I write, you might already know where this is going, but the truth is that I've found it difficult in the past to really nail the nuance involved here, so what I end up saying today may not be exactly the same as what I've written in the past. As everyone should be aware of by now, Norse mythology has gods and it has jötnar. And several actual myths involve the gods getting the better of the jötnar, whether that's by killing them, or stealing their stuff, or taking advantage of their women, or finding some loophole in a deal they've made. And modern media has really decided to run with this idea recently. Within the past few years alone, we've had two extremely popular video games in the God of War franchise, which portray the Norse gods in an explicitly villainous light. And even more recently, Netflix launched an animated series led by Zack Snyder called Twilight of the Gods that really leans into this picture of Thor as some kind of raging genocidal maniac, just murdering innocent jötnar left and right for essentially no reason at all. If you step outside of popular media and into the internet, you start to run into even more interesting takes on the Aesir versus jötnar dynamic. Some people will agree with the idea that it's the gods who are the real bad guys of the story, or at the very least that they're horrendous jerks who bring ruin upon themselves with their own bad behavior. Some will go so far as to tell you that the ancient Norse people had no concept of good and evil at all, and that this is an idea that was later imposed on pagan mythology by Christians. And a lot of people will tell you that even if good and evil did exist in the Norse mind, the mythology isn't really about that. Instead, they'll say it's about order versus chaos, with the universe demanding some kind of a balance between the two. To be fair, there are little hints of truth in most of these takes. It's just that there are better, more holistic takes that we can have. They just require us to consider our sources in context, accept some nuance, and not mix in other random ideas from other cultures based on the mistaken idea that all different kinds of ancient pagans must have thought about everything the exact same way. Now, let me pause there for a second, because I said the phrase hints of truth, which sort of implies that I'm about to give you the full objective truth about something. But I want to put a disclaimer on that. Remember, I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan. I can be wrong, and I can also miss the full picture sometimes. As you've probably heard me say a couple times already, I also understand that some people have forged their own spiritual connections with this material, and I have no desire to dismantle that, or to tell you how to be a pagan, or to make myself some kind of single source of truth for how you should understand Norse mythology. All I'm trying to do here is give you some kind of entertaining repackaging of myths supplemented by the opinions of modern experts in the academic community, specifically about how ancient people thought about things 1,000 years ago. If that doesn't fit with your own beliefs, that is totally fine with me. I have no motivation to tell you how to exercise your own spirituality today. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about what it means to be a good guy or a bad guy, and what we know about how the ancient Norse people thought about good and evil and how they worshipped supernatural beings. The first, most foundational point we need to establish here is that ancient Norse people had a real religion which they took very seriously. This wasn't a situation where people just sat around a campfire telling fun stories about superheroes and then went about their life with a secular worldview the next day. In modern times, we have the luxury of getting to choose what we believe from something like a buffet of philosophies. Because we have access to so much information, we can examine alternative or even competing explanations for how the world functions whenever we want. It's very easy not to be religious at all, for example, because we don't have all that many gaps left in our knowledge about how the things we can perceive with our senses actually work. These days, we know things like how the weather changes, and what stars are, and where diseases come from, and what cancer is, and what causes earthquakes, and what comets are, and why volcanoes erupt, and how bacterial infections can be fought with antibiotics, and all kinds of things like that the average Viking Age Scandinavian sees as a complete mystery. Even though they do notice the natural patterns in some of these things, they still have to rely on conventional folk wisdom to explain it all. And that folk wisdom involves gods and jötnar and dwarves and elves and all that kind of stuff. Most of these people were probably never even exposed to any kind of competing explanation. Imagine being in this position yourself. No internet, no encyclopedias, no books. Unless you live in a more prominent and internationally connected town, you may have never even met someone with a substantially different worldview or religion than what exists in your community. There are also social pressures to fit in with that community that are always in play. So just like people do today, you're going to understand the world based on what you've been taught and in some similar way to how other members of your social sphere do. And the communal acceptance you receive from signaling your adherence to the group's ideas is going to reinforce them for you as well. There's a popular view in modern paganism that ultimately ties back to some things written by some old Roman Neoplatonists like Sallustius, where the gods and the various myths about the gods are not to be seen as fully literal, but instead as more like metaphors designed to teach life lessons. In the old Neoplatonist mindset, you would actually say they are imperfect expressions of perfect Platonic forms. Technically, the old Neoplatonists weren't suggesting that divinity itself is just a metaphor, only that human conceptions of it are imperfect, and then more modern ideas have since been layered on top of that. Now, I'm not going to critique these ideas because, one, it would require you to be versed in Neoplatonic philosophy, or at the very least have a good understanding of Plato's theory of forms, and we don't really have time for all that. Plus, I'm not really a philosophy expert, and this isn't really that kind of show. And two, in the context of Norse paganism, it's a modern point of view, and like I said, I'm not here to teach you how to be a modern pagan. What I can say is that we really have no evidence to suggest that ancient Norse pagans subscribed to any kind of Neoplatonist philosophy or any other kind of non-literal interpretation of their religion. That being said, there are, of course, lessons to learn and metaphors present in myths, and we would probably be going too far to say that no Norse pagan ever questioned just how literally the entire corpus of myths that they had was supposed to be taken. Just because one thing is literal doesn't mean everything has to be literal. But from what we know about the belief system of the ancient Norse people, the gods themselves were not just metaphors designed to teach life lessons. And there is certainly no reason at all to believe they were thought of as several imperfect expressions of a single perfect divine entity of some kind. They were real, individual beings that played real roles in people's lives. For example, Odin and his brothers really did create the earth. Thor really does kill real jötnar, and Ragnarok really is going to happen one day. Hopefully this isn't too weird of an idea. Even today, there are religious people who really believe in a real God who really created the earth, and in things like real angels and real demons and all that kind of stuff. Remember that at some point the rubber has to meet the road. For the ancient Norse, their gods demanded big sacrifices. It wasn't just a small offering of food or a drink poured out or something symbolic like dedication of your time to a cause. Instead, it was more like the annual bloat is coming up and you're expected to sacrifice a bull to the gods, and that bull is a big chunk of your family's wealth. Or maybe it's one of those festivals we only have once every 9 years and you're going to have to hang one of your slaves. Or maybe you find yourself in some situation where the religion demands that you ritually throw away a bunch of gold into the local bog. And while you're at it, go ahead and destroy that expensive sword you own and throw that in there too for good measure. Altogether, there goes the equivalent of a new house. That's a lot of money to waste on a metaphor designed to teach you some good life lessons. If you don't actually believe making these kinds of sacrifices is really going to do something, how many years in a row are you going to keep making them, especially if you're not exactly financially comfortable? To say it in a modern Christian way, if God isn't really real, how motivated are you to keep shelling out money for your tithes, especially if you know your pastor is just literally throwing that money away into the local bog or lake. So, coming back around, Norse myths are expressions of real belief. Myths, just in general, are stories created by people who understand and adhere to a certain belief system, and they live their lives in that social context. These stories, therefore, contain high-level reflections of the roles that mythological characters play in the lives of believers. The easy example of this is Thor. I've mentioned certain archaeological artifacts on the show before, like the Canterbury Charm, the Kvinnaby Amulet, and the Sigtuna Amulet, that show how jötnar or Thursar were believed to be the cause of certain problems that plagued humanity, and that one of the solutions to this problem was to invoke Thor to smite the supernatural attacker in order to rescue the human. As a reminder, here is the Canterbury Charm. Gyrol sor thwara, farthu nu, funden thu, Thor vigithik thursadrotin, Gyrol sor thwara, vidar adravari. Gyrol Sorkazar, leave now, you are found. May Thor use his power upon you, Lord of Thursar, Gyrol Sorkazar, against blood infections. In the religious social context, people pray to Thor to rescue them from jötnar. So, what do we find Thor doing in the myths? Smiting jötnar. To reiterate, myths are not just fun superhero stories. Even if we choose to believe that a given story may not be a literal event that actually happened, it's still going to be an accurate reflection of the roles that its characters, if they're supernatural beings, play in the real lives of humans. Now, sometimes the roles of certain beings in ancient religion may not be fully obvious from the limited information available to us. We are very fortunate to have uncovered some of these artifacts that can help put things into perspective. But once we do get some additional perspective, we can turn to the myths themselves and start to verify what we've discovered. For example, we have stanza 22 of Heimskringla, which refers to Thor as Sá Oldum Berger, which means he who rescues mankind. But what does he rescue us from? Well, we can let Thor tell us in his own words in Harbarðsljóð 23. Mikil mundi at jötna ef allir lífði, vetter mundi manna under Midgarði. Mighty would be the family of jötnar if all of them lived. There would be no humans within Midgardr. There aren't many more statements clearer than this describing the dynamic between humans, jötnar, and gods, especially Thor. The fact that humans exist in this dynamic is key to properly interpreting the myth. Religions are created for humans, so the dynamic between gods and their antagonists only matters insofar as it affects the lives of humans somewhere down the chain. If we ask ourselves at a very high abstract level, why does the mythology have both gods and jötnar in the first place? The ultimate answer is likely going to have something to do with how the existence of both camps affects the lived experience of humans. By extension, if we're looking for some definition of supernatural good or bad relative to a culture that's not our own, and we know that they have different ideas than we do about murder, slavery, thievery, sex, gender, and pretty much everything else you can imagine, a good technique is to look at who's being worshipped and who isn't. And if that information isn't super clear, we can turn to examining how the behaviors of supernatural beings in myth result in a positive or negative outcome for humanity as a whole. Let's take a quick look at the myth about the mead of poetry, which I talked about back in episodes 7 and 8. This is one of those stories that has often been used to cast Odin in a relatively negative light, so let's take a deeper look. The short version of the story is this. There was once a wise god named Kvasir who had the misfortune of meeting up with a couple of murderous dwarves who killed him and made a special wisdom-bearing mead out of his special wisdom-bearing blood. Later, these same dwarves murdered a Jotun couple, and when their son showed up to take revenge, the dwarves offered him the mead in exchange for their lives, which he accepted. Now, at some point, Odin decides that the jötnar should not be in possession of the mead and that he needs to take it from them. So let's pause here and ask, why does Odin want the mead? The easy answer, of course, is that he's a selfish jerk who just takes what he wants by any means necessary. The more nuanced answer, however, which is probably the real answer, is that as long as the jötnar have something, humanity doesn't benefit from it. We know that at the end of this story, Odin does acquire the mead, and we know that as a result, humans now have poetry. And poetry is more than just art in the Norse mind. Being made from Kvasir's blood, it's the output of wisdom. It's also an integral part of religion, and religion is tied to literally everything in everyday life. Composing praise poetry to a deity is a form of prayer that results in positive benefit. Poetry is required for magical incantations that affect the world around you. It's an essential technique for preserving ancient knowledge in a time before the adoption of manuscript culture. In the Norse cultural worldview, humanity can't flourish without it. Odin, therefore, must get it so that we can have it. Meanwhile, the Jotun Suttungr has hidden it away and guarded it in a mountain so that no one but himself can drink it. Back to the story, Odin pays a visit in disguise to Suttungr's brother Baugi. He needs an in with Baugi, so he decides to capitalize on the classic greedy nature of the jötnar by offering Baugi's 9 slaves a really nice whetstone that can be used to sharpen their scythes. All of them want the whetstone for themselves, so when Odin tosses it up into the air, saying that whoever gets to it first can keep it, they all kill each other to get to it first. He doesn't kill them himself, but simply gives them an opportunity in the form of a life lesson for the audience to be the cause of their own undoing by virtue of their own greed. Baugi's new lack of slave labor allows Odin to ingratiate himself with the Jotun by doing all the work that 9 slaves would have done all by himself, and in return, he wants Baugi to help him get a drink of Suttungr's special mead. Baugi makes the request on Odin's behalf, but Suttungr refuses to allow anyone to have even a single drop. It is only after trying things the fair and reasonable way that Odin resorts to thievery. He and Baugi drill a hole into the side of the mountain where the mead is being kept so that Odin can transform into a snake and slither in. However, when he slithers into the hole, Baugi starts trying to stab him with the drill in treacherous Jotun fashion. Odin is a slippery little snake, though, so he evades Baugi's murder attempts and finds himself in the chamber where the mead is being guarded by Suttungr's daughter Gunnlöð. In order to get the mead from Gunnlöð, Odin wins her affection and stays with her for 3 nights, after which she agrees to give him 3 drafts of mead. However, tricky Odin uses his 3 drafts to empty all the mead into his stomach, transforms into an eagle, and flies away. Suttungr finds out about this, transforms into an eagle himself, and chases after Odin, at one point coming so close that Odin is forced to poop out some of the mead in order to get ahead again, and this nasty stuff is where bad poetry comes from in the end. And Odin ends up escaping back to Asgardr to redistribute the good mead amongst the gods and humanity. In the poem Havamal, Odin recounts this event, and in particular, he admits to having used Gunnlöð, who he refers to as a good woman, to get the mead. It reads as almost lamentful or regretful, and it's true that Odin manipulated Gunnlöð to get the mead. It seems pretty awful from our modern point of view, but the larger point is that Odin's procuring of the mead was an essential component in humanity's progress. One of his roles in the lives of humans, and thus in mythology, is to be a creator and preserver of our species and the world we live in. So, when finding himself unable to do this in the face of a greedy Jotun who won't let anyone near the mead, he must find another way to fulfill that role, even if it means doing something regrettable. It does seem true that Odin will resort to whatever means necessary to achieve his goals, but those goals are in the service of human existence and prosperity, and probably also fate. In fact, the myths are sort of rife with gods having to do regrettable things in order to fulfill their cosmic roles. In the myth where Thor's hammer is stolen, Thor is forced to dress up like a woman in order to get it back. Obviously, for a man to dress up like a woman isn't viewed the same way now as it was back then. But in ancient Norse society, this was an offense for which a wife could divorce her husband. It was a big deal. Thor protests having to do it for fear that the gods will call him Arger, which is pretty much the worst word you can call a man in terms of insulting his masculinity, and which gave him the legal right to kill you in a duel to reclaim his good name if you did it. But ultimately, Thor does this thing that society of the time abhors because he must do it in order to continue fulfilling his role as protector of the gods' creations, including humanity as a whole. And then for the audience, you get to think about how far you would go to protect your family and your homestead if you had to break certain social rules in order to do it. The underlying concept is similar in both stories. Humanity requires the necessary tools or protections in order to thrive, and it is the gods who secure them for us, whereas the Jotuns would instead take actions that hold humanity back or endanger it, or in many cases directly attack it. This is why Thor tells us that without his slaying of jötnar, there would be no humans within Midgardr, and this is also why we get quotes like Vafthrûdnismál 31, which I quoted at the beginning of this episode, and now in my own translation. Vafthrûdnir said, "Out of the Elivagar sprang venom drops, and waxed so until a Jotun came out of them. All our families came together from there, therefore they are always too fierce." Now, that word fierce comes from the Old Norse atal, which can also mean hideous or loathsome. Contextually, it's a negative word. It's like a bad kind of fierce. And it's being used here to say that all the families of Jötnar have this negative trait because the first of their kind was born from venom-infected waters. This sort of thinking is likely why Snorri gave us that quote about Ymir. "Han illr och allir hans ættmenn." He is evil, and all of his kinsmen. As much as some people strangely dislike Snorri, a lot of his material is really just lifted straight out of pagan-era poems like Völuspá, Grímnismál, and Vafthrûdnismál. But anyway, this is another one of those quotes showing how evil natures quite frequently pass from fathers to sons in Norse stories. It's why Signy couldn't produce courageous sons with her treacherous husband King Siggeir in Volsunga Saga, and in my own opinion, this is probably also why the ancestry of the gods needs to include this Buri guy. If the gods were descendants of Ymir on their father's side, they probably would have inherited his bad nature like other Jötnar. However, by including Buri in the family line, the gods are able to intermarry with Jotun women and can still retain a comparatively braver, more noble nature coming from their father's side. But let's talk about what evil means here. The ancient Norse people absolutely did have a concept of good and evil. However, that concept didn't perfectly match with our ideas of good and evil today. There's a bit of a Venn diagram thing going on there where there is some degree of overlap and also some differences. But what we're talking about here specifically is a sense of moral good and moral bad. To maybe oversimplify the system a bit, the behaviors considered good are behaviors that lead to glory, wealth, and posterity without hurting your own community. The behaviors considered bad are things that make you a liability to your own community. This is why you can go on a Viking raid without anyone judging you poorly for pretty much anything you may have done to the poor villagers off in Ireland or wherever. But if you come back home and perjure yourself or kill someone without paying the necessary compensation fee or seduce another man's wife, guess what? The seeress from Völuspá has seen your future in the afterlife being torn up by a wolf and chewed up by the dragon Nidhogr under the venom that drips from the ceiling in the serpent-ridden hall on Nastrond, the corpse beach. You're one of the worst Nidhingers, so out you go to some level of the underworld that is objectively unpleasant as a religious consequence for your bad behavior, evil. Other examples of moral bad include breaking gender taboos. Then there's things like treason and treachery, kings being too stingy with their wealth, breaking the rules of hospitality, and stuff like that. There were, of course, shades and degrees of bad, just as there are today, but ancient Norse society certainly did have a sense of moral good and moral bad. It's just not a situation where exercising brotherly love for all your fellow humans across the planet is going to get you into a paradisiacal heaven. The system is different, but the concept still exists. But let's get back to this idea that all the families of the Jötnar are always, quote, too fierce, or that all of Ymir's kinsmen are evil. The problem with these statements is that they are generalizations that don't always match the details. Remember, Odin himself referred to the Jotun Gunnlóð as a good woman. And in fact, there are lots of examples of Jötnar not being evil. Apart from Gunnlóð, there's Gerður, the girl with the shiniest arms who married Freyr and became a goddess. There's Skadi, the woman who fairly demanded compensation from the gods for the killing of her father Thjatsi after he kidnapped Idun and ended up marrying Njordr to become a goddess herself. There's Gríðr, the woman who assisted Thor with a place to stay and a few magic items on his journey to Geirröðr's stead. There's Ægir, who regularly hosts feasts for the gods. There's Mimir, who is pretty likely a Jotun, though we don't know this for sure, and gives Odin counsel all the time. Depending on how you interpret a stanza in the poem Heimskringla, it's possible that Thor's helpers Thjalfi and Roskva are also Jötnar. Odin's mother is a Jotun, Thor's mother is a Jotun. Exceptions are everywhere. So ultimately, we have to reconcile this notion that the jötnar are considered bad as a class with the idea that individual jötnar are sometimes either proactively good or are at least not causing problems for the gods and humanity. What's going on here is that the Aesir are a high-status clan of supernatural beings who are motivated to create and preserve the cosmos, which of course implies creating and preserving humanity as well at the most meaningful level. Meanwhile, various clans of jötnar, and I say various clans because several different individuals are identified as Jotun lords or thirst lords, and usually these groups are oriented towards destroying these things. At an individual level, they are trying to make you sick or destroy your farm, or whatever the case may be. Ancient Norse people prayed and sacrificed to the gods in hopes of fixing and preventing exactly these kinds of problems. We might go so far as to say that this is at least one major reason why the religion contains jötnar and why it contains gods. And to reiterate for the 1000th time, this is why Thor kills jötnar, and it's why he only selectively kills the jötnar who are causing problems and leaves others like Aegir and Gríðr alone or even befriends them. When it comes to the idea of order versus chaos, as I mentioned, there's a hint of truth here as well. But gods and jötnar don't represent some sort of cosmic yin and yang where the world thrives best when both elements are balanced and respected. Order and chaos, if we want to use those words, have very specific meanings in this context. Order would have to mean preservation of the world so that life can thrive in it, and chaos would be opposition to that. It would have to be burning all of that down and killing everything, like we see at Ragnarok. There is a very clear sense in the sources that the gods are the good guys and the jötnar, as a class, are the bad guys, especially when we remember that religion exists for people. So the key dynamic here is less about how these two groups relate to each other and much more about their relationships with humanity. Consequently, we see tons of evidence of ancient people worshipping the gods of Norse mythology in both literature and archaeology. But evidence that anybody was ever worshipping jötnar in the pagan period is extremely weak, if there even really is any evidence for that at all. Margaret Clunies Ross summarized the current state of scholarly understanding in this way, quote, "The majority opinion is that cults of the giants, jötnar, of Old Norse myth are unlikely to have existed, because on the whole, giants were conceptualized as hostile to both gods and humans. Sacrifices and other acts directed at the propitiation of giants would therefore have been unlikely to have achieved a positive outcome for humans." End quote. Now, before you start shouting out examples of times you heard about where the sources claim somebody was worshipping a Jotun, I should add that there is nuance here, as there is in most things, and I'll get to that. Firstly, I just want to drive home the point that ancient Norse people saw the gods they worshipped as good guys. Listen to how stanzas 2 and 3 of Hyndluljóð talk about Odin, for example. "Han gelder och gefur gulverðugum, gav han Hermóði hjálm och brynju, en Sigmundi sverð att þiggja, gefur han Siggersumum en sumum aura, malsku morgum och manvit fyrum, buri gefur han brognum en bragskoldum, gefur han mansemi morgum rekki." And in my own translation, "He makes payment and gives gold to the worthy. He gave Hermóðr a helmet and byrny, and Sigmundr a sword to receive. He gives victory to some, and money to some, eloquence to many, and common sense to mankind. He gives a fair wind to men, and poetry to skalds. He gives manliness to many warriors." This is not a dangerous to worship, morally ambiguous trickster ready to turn on his followers at a moment's notice for his own selfish motivations. This is a generous giver of things like wealth, wit, words, wisdom, war gear, and weather. One who has, from time to time, resorted to trickery in order to fulfill his cosmic role of doing exactly these things for humanity. Freyr is another god who is quite highly spoken of in poetry, but we have to reconcile the way we think about social dynamics with the way these ancient people did. On the one hand, Freyr obtains Gerður as a wife initially by sending Skirnir, who threatens her with all kinds of horrible curses, to coerce her into her first romantic rendezvous with Freyr. But on the other hand, this is how Freyr is talked about in Lokasenna 37. "Freyr betstur allra ballriða ossa gorðum I. Mau han ne gröttir ne manskonu och löser or hoptum hvern. Freyr is the best of all the bold riders in the Aesir's courts. He doesn't make a girl cry, nor a man's wife, and looses everyone from fetters. In terms of core traits, Odin gives you gifts, Freyr frees you from fetters and is nice to women, and Thor rescues you from Jotun attacks. This kind of thing is why it's so crazy to see the gods portrayed as the bad guys so often in modern media. I use the Christianity example a lot because it's still pretty widespread and most people have at least some degree of exposure to it or some basic knowledge about it. So think about it this way. Thor and Jesus are both savior figures in their own ways. Both embody certain ideals that people are meant to look up to and emulate. Both are so closely connected to the average believer's life that they wear an emblem of their God around their neck all the time. And both are symbols of divine protection against evil. So if we pretend that Twilight of the Gods had been written in a Christian context instead of a Norse mythological context, what you'd have is a story about a ruthless Jesus of Nazareth who murders an innocent family, leaving only one survivor, who then teams up with Judas Iscariot in a revenge plot to kill Jesus. And if that wasn't absurd enough, if you've seen Twilight of the Gods and some of the other things Thor does in that show, you can imagine exactly how angry Christians would be to see Jesus portrayed in some of those same scenarios. This is not who Jesus is in Christianity. It's not his role in the life of Christians, and it would subvert the whole point of the religion. Ancient Norse paganism is not Christianity, of course, and Thor is not Jesus. But the same level of absurdity exists in the Norse context here. The Thor we are shown in this show is not who the mythological Thor is. His behavior does not represent his role in the cosmos or in the life of humans, and this presentation essentially misunderstands the whole point of Norse mythology. Of course, there are no ancient Norse pagans around to be offended by these sorts of subversive, what if the good guys were actually the bad guys all along kinds of stories that entertainment studios keep pumping out left and right. And entertaining though they might be, we just shouldn't use them to inform our understanding of real Norse mythology. So earlier, I said there's some nuance to the idea about whether or not ancient people ever worshipped jötnar. The first step to understanding this is realizing that we're dealing with beings here who mean things. As a friend of mine once said, when we're talking about who's a god and who's a Jotun, we're not dealing with Mendel's pea plants. We're dealing with social facts. It's not about genetics or lineage, it's about roles. Just because some individual is very powerful doesn't mean they get to be called a god in the Old Norse religious worldview. What we find in pagan-era poetry, for example, is that words like goð, which means god or gods, or tívar, which also means gods, and other words like this for deity, only ever get applied to members of the Æsir or Vanir groups. These kinds of words are never used for the jötnar, who are antagonistic towards those groups. If we think about cases of certain individuals who we know were venerated and who also began life among the jötnar, and by the way, these are almost always actually women, for example, Skadi or Gerður, what we see is that these individuals either marry into the Æsir clan or have a child with someone in the Æsir clan or in some way become allied to the Æsir clan before they come to be thought of as gods or goddesses. It's this alliance with the Æsir that justifies using a word like goð for one of these individuals and justifies venerating them. So in other words, for an individual to be worthy of worship or to be conceptualized in the category of deity, a character has to ally themselves with the cosmological cause of protecting and preserving humanity. Then on the other hand, if we consider somebody like Hrungnir, who you may recall is the Jotun who tried to duel Thor with a whetstone after losing a horse race to Odin and threatening to steal Valhall and kidnap the goddesses, this is somebody who would never be referred to with a word like goð, or any other similar word for deity in the pagan-era context. Because you have to understand what his threats mean from the perspective of humanity. He wants to upset the cosmological order for his own gain, which will always be very detrimental to us. Whatever benefit humanity gets from the roles played by those goddesses is taken away, because Hrungnir would be keeping them for himself, just like Suttungr hoarding the mead of poetry for himself, or the wall builder who wanted the sun and moon and Freya for himself. Imagine what happens to life on Earth if a Jotun takes the sun and hoards it away so we no longer get any benefit from it. Plants and animals and everyone else dies. We see this principle in action in the myth where Thjatsi kidnaps Idun. By taking her for himself, her apples are removed from the cosmological order, and all the other gods begin deteriorating. So Hrungnir, Suttungr, and Thjatsi are very much not gods, regardless of how powerful they may be. If this is a new idea for you, you may be saying right now, but what about all the historical examples I've heard about where people do worship jötnar? And if that's you, chances are you've probably only actually heard 2 examples. The first one probably concerns a family performing a cultic ritual around a horse penis, and the other one probably has something to do with archaeological finds at an Icelandic cave called surtshellir. Can you think of any others? Probably not, right? Don't get me wrong, there are actually a few interesting little anecdotes that do exist in old literature, but these are the 2 examples that everybody talks about, and the 2 of them are all we really need to illustrate the important points here. The horse penis story is called Volsaþáttur, which is preserved in Flateyjarbók in the saga of St. Óláf and was probably written in the 1300s. Here's the story, and fair warning, this is not a story for kids. I will have to tame it down so that I don't have to put an explicit label on this episode. So Olaf, King of Norway, in the year of our Lord 1029, has a conundrum. Most of his country still hasn't converted to Christianity. So, as he has occasion to travel around to different parts of Norway, he takes every opportunity he can find to do missionary work, and tends to have a lot of success as he does it. Now, as it so happens, there's a particular farm in a remote part of northern Norway where an elderly farmer lives with his wife and 2 children, a son and a daughter, as well as their slave girl, who also lives in the house and, of course, the family dog. And the whole family is, forgive me while I take a moment to clutch my pearls, pagan. One autumn, a horse on the farm dies, and since pagans used to eat horse meat, the dead horse is cut up and used for food. One of the outside slaves is doing the butchering, and as part of the process, he of course removes the horse's penis, which in Old Norse we apparently call a volsi, and is likely the same word we see in Volsung from Volsunga Saga, but before this guy can toss the thing away, the farmer's son runs up and snatches it. And because this kid is just a master of comedy, he runs into the house with the volsi and he waves it in front of the slave maid's face, and he says, in poetic verse, he says, "Check out this powerful volsi I got. I bet I know what you'd want to use this for." And by the way, as I said, I am taming this down quite a bit. So anyway, as you might expect, the maid thinks this is absolutely hilarious and is not bothered in the slightest. The boy's sister, on the other hand, thinks this is pretty unseemly and tells him to get that nasty thing out of here. But about this time, the old farmer's wife intervenes and says, no, we don't want to waste anything that could be useful. So she takes the volsi and dries it out and preserves it with some leeks and other herbs and saves it in a box so it won't rot. And from then on, every evening, the farmer's wife institutes some kind of a worship ritual for the volsi, leading her whole family down the path of this unholy error. And by the power of Satan, yes, that's what the story really says, by the power of Satan, the volsi continually grows bigger and, quote, stronger until it can stand up next to the farmer's wife. And every night she lifts it up and carries it into the living room where she makes each member of the family, including the slave maid, recite a verse over it. One day, King Olaf hears about how backwards the people living in this general remote part of Norway are, and he wants to go teach them about the proper faith. So he heads up there and takes his 2 buddies, Finn and Thormod, with him. The 3 of them disguise themselves with gray cloaks so they don't look like a royal retinue, and they all adopt the fake name Grimr because even in one of the most overtly Christian-biased stories ever told, we still have to have some Odin symbolism. Of course, the 3 Grimrs end up at the farm, and they are invited in for the night, which you may know by now is actually pretty standard hospitality for Scandinavia at the time. And when they sit down in the living room, the story takes special care to tell us how the seats were arranged. The king's buddy Finn sits on the inside and is flanked by Thormod and King Olaf on the outside. This matters because later the whole family is going to come sit down in kind of like a circle, and it's important to point out where the king is sitting so he can be the last one who gets to take a turn to talk in that circle. So, as the sun goes down, people are starting to gather in, and the first family member to come into the living room and greet the guests is the farmer's daughter, who puts on a lantern or some kind of light, and then she takes a good look at her guests and isn't fooled at all. she clocks King Olaf almost immediately. Probably because, even with his gray cloak, it's apparently still a very expensive-looking gray cloak, and he's not doing a great job of hiding all of his jewelry and fancy stuff underneath. So she calls him out as being the king, which she does in poetic verse, and he responds by calling her wise and saying essentially like, shh, maybe let's not mention that for right now. So the daughter leaves, and pretty soon in comes the farmer and his son and the slave maid, and they all start trying to make cheerful conversation with their surprise guests. But the king and his buddies, who are impersonating Odin, I guess, aren't really saying much in response. They're just kind of sitting there looking grim to match their names. And at some point, the table is set and the food is served, and the guests are still acting awkward and stuff, and then suddenly the old farmer's wife comes in carrying the Volsi. She heads over to her husband, unwraps it from the cloth she had around it, puts it on his knee, and recites this verse. Aukin ertu Volsi, och uppum tecken, linni gadder en laukum studder, thiggi mornir thette blöti, en thu bondi sjálfur, ber thu at ther Volsa. You are enlarged, Volsi. Yes, it's a gross joke. The source text is full of them. And lifted up, provided with linen, and supported by leeks. May Mornir receive this offering, but you, the farmer himself, you take the Volsi to yourself. Which means, now it's the farmer's turn to recite a verse, which he does reluctantly, but his is kind of like, if I had my way, we wouldn't be doing this right now, but sure, may Mornir receive this offering. And now, son, it's your turn. Ever the comedian who forces me to censor my content, the son recites a gross little verse about bridesmaids moistening the Volsi later this evening. He throws in the obligatory, may Mornir receive this offering, and then hands it to his sister. The wise farmer's daughter does not like this ritual, but because she has to follow the rules of the house, she takes it and recites a verse that goes basically, I swear by Gevyun and the other gods that I'm being forced to do this. May Mornir receive this offering. Here you go, slave maid, your turn. So the slave maid takes it and says in verse, I sure wish I could have a loaf of bread as broad and thick as this thing on workdays. May Mornir receive this offering. Here, other slave maid, your turn. Surprise! There's another slave maid. So the other slave maid, who has totally been here the whole time, by the way, takes the Volsi, and because she's also gross, her verse goes, certainly I would not be able to resist using this thing if I could be alone with it. May Mornir receive this offering. But you, Grimir number 1, now you take the Volsi. So the king's buddy Finn takes the Volsi and kind of goes with the flow. His verse is tame, especially compared to some of these others, and talks about sailing, but he bids Mornir receive the offering and passes it off to Grimir number 2, Thormoth, whose verse mentions never having seen a phallus getting passed around quite like this, then bids Mornir accept the offering and says, now it's your turn, Chief Grimir. So King Olaf takes the Volsi, and his verse goes, I have been the helmsman and prowman and leader of all peoples. May Mornir receive this offering, but you, dog of the house, you take care of this monster. And he throws the Volsi to the dog, who immediately starts chewing it up. The old woman, of course, freaks out, and she recites a verse that both questions what kind of guy throws holy offerings to dogs, and also begs the dog not to swallow this one. But it's at this moment that King Olaf dramatically throws off his cloak and reveals his true identity. And then, by the power of God and through Olaf's own personal passionate preaching, paganism is finally rejected at the farmstead and everybody gets baptized. You see, once they became aware of who they should believe in, they immediately knew their true creator and realized how badly and inhumanely they'd been living when compared to good people. King Olaf was like that, you know. He just really wanted to stamp out immorality, paganism, and similar superstitions everywhere in Norway, and of course convert as many people as he could, and by golly, it's now become so clear just how well he pleased God in his endeavors. The end. So the first question we obviously have to ask ourselves when considering this story is, who the heck is Mornir? The problem we run into trying to answer this question is that the word Mornir is used in a very limited way within this story. Grammatically, by this story alone, we can't even tell if it's supposed to be a masculine singular word or a feminine plural word. One interpretation is that this is intended to mean something like Jötunwomen, but that interpretation has also been heavily criticized by scholars. Beyond that, scholars have suggested that this could be a reference to a sword, to a goddess, possibly Vanir, maybe not, or even to Freyr himself, which Jens Peter Schjødt points out is actually the most common interpretation among scholars. though Schjødt himself actually prefers interpreting this as a reference to a localized deity. Fortunately, the word Mornir does occur in one other place, which is a standalone verse preserved in Snorri's Heimskringla. The context is that King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, or more specifically his steward, a guy named Birgir, has seized a shipwrecked Icelandic vessel, and Icelanders have all started composing Nýð poetry against King Harald in response. If you'll recall, Nýð means like shameful behavior, so they're all writing these verses accusing him and Birgir of shameful stuff. And here's the verse that matters here. Foss sparen å må mornis, mordkunner Haraldur sunnon, vas þá vinda myrdir, vaks eit I hamfaxa, en bergsalar Birgir, bondum räcker I landi, that så old I joldu, rykker fyrer liki. When battle-famous Harald kicked from the south against Mornir's heath in stallion's form, he was just wax, and powerless Birgir, rejected in the land by the deities of rock-halls, was in front in a mare's likeness. People saw that. If you didn't pick up on it, this is a classic ergi insult. We have Harald in stallion's form, with Birgir in front of him as a mare. Birgir is powerless, but Harald, to his shame, is soft like wax, and worst of all, people saw that. More importantly, in this interaction, Harald is kicking from the south against, quote, Mornir's heath. We know that Mornir is associated with the horse phallus, so we can probably assume that Mornir's heath is a kenning referring to the field upon which the horse phallus rides, or in other words, the mare's backside. One thing we can say for certain is that this word only ever shows up in the context of sex jokes involving horses. In that case, the form we see in this verse, mornis, tells us that this is not a feminine plural word, so it's not a reference to Jötun women. As a masculine singular, it also isn't a reference to any singular goddess, Vanir or otherwise. It's not likely a sword, and since Freyr isn't really known for bestiality, I'm skeptical it's a reference to him either. Nobody knows for sure who or what this is, but my personal guess is that this is probably just a word for a stallion's genitals, or otherwise to some kind of deified spirit of the Volsi idol. But what is not clear at all is that this is any kind of reference to a Jötun, and there is also no evidence at all that it refers to some character who would have had an antagonistic relationship with the Norse gods. All we can say for sure is that this association between Mornir and gross horse stuff appears in two late Christian texts telling stories about things that happened back in ye old pagan days. And this is sort of the key here. It's impossible to overlook how overtly biased the Völsungatháttr story is towards Christianity. And this is a pretty common trait we find among texts that talk about practices that could be interpreted as Jötun worship. These are texts that Clunies Ross describes as following, and I'm going to splice a few quotes from the same paper together here. They are, quote, texts of relatively late date that recreate the period of conversion to Christianity in the North and represent the activities of those living in remote locations who continued to practice pagan cults in the face of a growing pressure to convert. Though some of these texts are relatively reliable and may contain elements of truth, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that some of them apply a somewhat stereotyped template involving a later Christian view of the nature of pagan worship. There is some evidence that certain kinds of beings were associated with particular places as their guardian spirits, and it is conceivable that such figures could have been the recipients of cult in the pre-Christian period in Scandinavia. Such figures have some of the same qualities as the Landvættir, guardian spirits of a region or a specific place, rather than of the jötnar of the major mythological narratives." End quote. So the idea is basically this. Even if there's some evidence that some pre-Christian Scandinavians worshipped specific beings not named among the Asir or Vanir, and maybe have never been named in source material as gods, all the evidence we have indicates that this kind of worship was generally directed towards individuals who interacted positively with humanity, and I guess at least neutrally towards the gods. What we don't see are pre-Christian Scandinavians worshipping any of the gods' mythological antagonists. Unless, of course, we do. Because there's sort of a big question here around what the word worship really means. Typically, worship is defined as expressing reverence and adoration for a deity. But imagine a hypothetical scenario with me. Imagine you live in a small farming community on the edge of some dark forest somewhere, And one day, a giant monster comes raging out of the forest and eats all your livestock and burns all your fields, and then takes off back into the woods after destroying everything. Afterwards, you really have no choice other than to try and overcome the loss and start rebuilding your livelihood. But what if that monster comes back again in the future? You probably want to assess that risk, so you venture out into the woods and you find the monster cave. You go inside and ask the monster what you can do to prevent him from ravaging your farm again, and he says that every month you have to come to his cave and recite a new poem you've composed telling him how awesome he is, and maybe leave some offerings here and there as well. If he feels appreciated, he'll leave you alone. Easy. For the next 100 years, this is what you and the other villagers do. On a daily basis, you're praying to the Aesir and maybe beseeching Thor and Odin for things. But once a month, someone from the community heads into the woods and recites a praise poem for the big evil monster just to make sure he never comes back. In this scenario, are you worshiping the monster? Keep that question in mind while we switch gears over to the most commonly cited example of Jötun worship from the pre-Christian period in Iceland. There is a cave there called surtshellir, very obviously named after the Jötun Surtur, who is the very definition of a mythological antagonist who wants to kill the gods and eventually destroy the world at Ragnarok. As it so happens, evidence of some kind of ritual practice has been found inside surtshellir, spanning roughly the last century of Iceland's pagan period. And that same idea is even found in literature. Landnámabók contains an episode where a character named Thorvaldur Hólbarki travels to Surtshellir specifically to perform a praise poem he has composed in honor of Surtur. So, how can we possibly get around this one? Surely this means pagan Icelanders were worshipping antagonistic jötnar, right? Bertha Phillpotts and Finnur Magnusson both concluded that this must have been the site of a cult dedicated to Surtur. I mean, just look at the evidence. But let's also take a look at the history of Surtshellir. This is a cave situated in the Hallmundarhraun lava field. It's situated in a lava field because it was part of the Schjødt volcano eruption that created that lava field beginning somewhere between the years of 880 and 910 AD. I say beginning because this particular type of Schjødt volcano eruption is a long-lasting process that can span anywhere from 5 to 50 years before lava actually stops flowing. Kevin Smith et al. Noted that in this particular case, quote, its lava ran more than 50 kilometers down from ice-shrouded highlands into newly settled valleys, burying 240 square kilometers of valuable upland grazing land and fertile lowland valleys beneath black, smoking basalt. Hjartarson suggests that 5 farms mentioned in Landnámabók, whose locations are unknown today, may have been buried under the lava. The impacts of this eruption must have been unsettling, posing existential challenges for Iceland's newly arrived settlers. It may have been possible to adapt day-to-day activities in response to an eruption flowing slowly for decades, yet the fear and dread of living with something so destructive for much of a lifetime, not knowing whether it would ever end, must have been extremely challenging. On the other hand, experiencing an eruption capable of covering 240 square kilometers of land in just a few years would have revealed almost unfathomable levels of destructive power to anyone living in its vicinity. The advance of the lava would not have been the only challenge these early settlers faced, since Schjødt eruptions release massive amounts of toxic gases that can flow into low-lying valleys, accumulating in low-lying depressions, hollows, and caves, poisoning the air, killing vegetation, livestock, and people, and damaging land far beyond the eruption's immediate vicinity. End quote. In other words, the story of Surtshellir begins with a natural disaster. The volcano erupts, lava spills out everywhere, likely destroying farms and causing untold levels of damage, even killing plants and animals with invisible toxic gas over a period of time that might have lasted for decades. And then over time, it finally stops and takes a number of years to sufficiently cool. Witnesses to that catastrophe are then the first ones able to venture into the cave and potentially begin some kind of ritual practice there. What do you suppose they hoped to accomplish with that? Personally, I side with Smith in thinking that, quote, it is hard not to conclude that the actions undertaken inside Surtshellir were initially done in response to the existential challenges that the Hallmundarhraun eruption presented to Iceland's newly arrived Norse settlers. Bertha Phillpotts and Finnur Magnusson's suggestion that Surtshellir was the site of a cult devoted to Surtur rather than efforts done to constrain him, may have missed the mark." End quote. It's always possible, of course, that Smith could be wrong, and that Philpotts and Magnusson could be right. But if so, Surtshellir is a weird outlier. It doesn't match the attitude recorded in pre-Christian literature, and it doesn't even match the attitude recorded later in biased Christian literature. On the other hand, Surtur could very easily have been that monster in the woods from my earlier hypothetical scenario, minus the woods, of course. Remember, Iceland was deforested pretty quickly after Norse settlers arrived. But that's neither here nor there. Obviously, in something like Christianity, you wouldn't write a praise poem to Satan in order to keep him away, right? But there's really no reason to believe that ancient Norse pagans might not have done something exactly like that. Surtur burns up a few farms and kills a few animals, maybe even people, and once his rampage is over, they start doing things designed to prevent him from rampaging again, which, if so, must have seemed like a successful endeavor for the next 100 years or so, before everybody converted to Christianity. But does that count as worship? Is worship still worship if it's done out of fear rather than reverence or adoration? What if it's done ironically or on a dare? Maybe? Probably? We're not necessarily using the right words when we say that ancient Norse people did or didn't worship the jötnar, or that they only worshipped the gods, or anything like that. What's better is that we try to put ourselves in their mindset and try to figure out what they are trying to accomplish with ritual practice and why. Whether or not ancient Icelanders were technically worshipping Surtur, was it because they wanted him to begin Ragnarok and kill them all? Or was it because they wanted him to leave them alone and stop burning up their farms? The best we can do here is compare this instance to everything else we know about ancient worship and all the patterns that have survived. And when we do that, those patterns indicate that jötnar who are antagonistic to the gods desire things that are catastrophic to humanity, and that humans supplicate the gods to protect them from attacks by exactly these sorts of beings. As Clunies Ross said, trying to garner the favor of antagonistic jötnar would probably not have achieved a positive outcome for humans. But hey, as I said before, you are free to do you. After all, when Ragnarok comes around, we're all going to die anyway. But with any luck, we won't have to wait quite that long before the next episode of Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Giants by Margaret Clunies Ross in Pre-Christian Religions of the North, Volume 2, 2020. Cyclical Rituals by Jens Peter Schjødt, also in Pre-Christian Religions of the North, Volume 2, 2020. Ritual Responses to Catastrophic Volcanism in Viking Age Iceland, Reconsidering Surtshellir Cave through Bayesian Analyses of AMS Dates, Tephrochronology, and Texts by Kevin Smith et al. In the Journal of Archaeological Science, Volume 126, 2021. Lausavísa from Óláfs Saga Tryggvasonar in Heimskringla 1 by Diana Whaley, and Poetry from the King Sagas 1 from Mythical Times to circa 1035, Skaldic Poetry of the Scandinavian Middle Ages 1, 2012. The Poetic Edda, translated by Caroline Larrington 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Falks 1995.